Welcome, everyone. My name is Carrie Ost, and I'm happy to be the moderator for today's program. Today, we're here with a small in-person audience and a virtual audience on the YouTube live stream. To start, to help create a shared understanding of who we are as a community and what we believe in, I will share a quote from the Bristol Humanist Group. Humanism is an approach to life based on reason and our common humanity, recognizing that moral values are properly founded on human nature and experience alone. Our programs address a wide variety of topics, including current events, philosophy, arts, and sciences, to name just a few. Today's presentation is part of our ongoing programming related to health. After the presentation, the audience will be invited to ask questions. This morning, our speaker is Dr. Nick Tiller, and he will be talking about science and pseudoscience in health and fitness. Nick Tiller is an exercise physiology researcher at Harbor UCLA, a columnist at Skeptical Inquirer magazine, and author of the award-winning book, The Skeptic's Guide to Sports Science. Please welcome Nick Tiller.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and a huge thank you for the invitation. It's an honor to be talking to you today, both the live audience and the people watching at home. This is a subject about which I'm extremely passionate, and you'll see that as we get into the talk. I'm actually going to time myself so that I try and stay more or less within the time restraints, because otherwise I could talk about this stuff all day. And you'll see once we get started why this is actually so important, not just for consumers of health and fitness. And really, you're a consumer of health and fitness if you've ever tried a diet, if you've been to the gym or spinning class, if you've ever had physiotherapy or something like acupuncture, if you've ever tried a supplement, then you are a consumer in the $4 trillion health and fitness industry. So it's not just about athletes and being in peak physical condition. This is really applicable to everyone in the sort of mainstream society, whether or not you're an avid exerciser. And the implications of science and pseudoscience in health and fitness actually extend far beyond the health and fitness industry. A couple of my affiliations here, Center for Inquiry and UCLA. So I'm sure most of you will recognize this chap. This is Michael Phelps, the most successful Olympian in history, not just the most successful swimmer, but the most successful Olympian of all time, which is really saying something. And these images were taken at the Rio Olympic Games in 2016. And while most people were in awe of Michael Phelps's record-breaking performances, when he came down to the starting blocks and stripped off the swimming finals, when I saw these circular purple bruises all over his back and shoulders, I watched with my head in my hands, because I knew what had caused these bruises and what the implications would potentially be, not just for swimming, but the world of health and fitness, potentially for decades to come. We'll come back to Phelps and we'll talk about cupping therapy in just a moment. But before we get into the talk, I'm zooming to you from Hermosa Beach, California. This is where I'm based at the moment. You'll probably guess by my accent, I'm not American. I actually, I'm from England, from the United Kingdom originally. I have a history working in high performance sports. So I worked here for a few years. This is Bisham Abbey High Performance Center, where I worked with the English Institute of Sport, which is the service provider of choice for some of the Olympic performance programs in the United Kingdom. And after leaving the EIS, I went and did my PhD in human applied physiology at Brunel University, all the way over in West London. And after being an associate professor in the United Kingdom for 4 years, I then came to Harbor UCLA Medical Center, where I'm based now. So just a bit of a background as to why I'm talking to you about this today. A couple of definitions before we get into the main bulk of the talk, because it struck me when I was preparing for this, how much of an overlap there really is between the ethos of humanism and the ethos of scientific skepticism. In fact, I think there's so much of an overlap that most humanists, I think, are skeptics, or at least they are science enthusiasts, And I've highlighted, these aren't perfect definitions by any stretch, but I've highlighted just a couple of the important words here. And these words actually came up in the quote that Carrie read at the start. This idea that humanism embraces human reason, and usually secular ethics, rejecting religious dogma, but particularly in terms of relevance to this talk, supernaturalism and superstition. So we kind of reject these ideas and we try and follow a path of reason and logic. And scientific skepticism, in many ways, is the same kind of thing. The idea is that we question the veracity of claims that lack empirical evidence, and we follow science and reason and logic to form valid conclusions. And the other thing that struck me was how much of a stark contrast there is between the ethics and the ethos of both humanism and skepticism and the modern day commercial health and fitness industry, which is really concerned with free enterprise geared towards generating profit, usually at the expense of science and the expense of logic and reason. And what we'll see throughout this talk is that really in the modern health and wellness industry, science takes a backseat to marketing, and marketing really is king. All of these ideas were kind of, I suppose, brought together in my book that was published last year. I know it's a shameless plug, but the reason I'm mentioning it is because for the last 10 years or so, I've been trying to move the two worlds of scientific skepticism and the health and fitness industry a little bit closer together. And that's what I tried to do in my book here. So throughout the remainder of the talk, we are going to, of course, be debunking various health and fitness myths and misinformation, because that's always fun. That's an important part of it, but that can't be the only part. We've got to do a little bit more than that. We've got to explore decision-making in health and fitness, how and why people make the decisions that they do, and particularly how health marketing is exploiting our biases in order to make a sale. We will highlight the mismatch between the claims and the evidence in health and fitness, and it's pretty huge. And we'll discuss the implications of pseudoscience in sport. And here's a hint, it extends far beyond the world of sport. So let's start by a little bit of consciousness raising, to use a Richard Dawkins term. As I've mentioned at the start, the health and wellness industry is worth something like $4 trillion at the last estimation. And this is made from the sale of fad diets and exercise classes, supplements, compression tights, gym memberships, various hardware, abdominal muscle stimulators, products and practices. And throughout the talk, when I use the term product, I'm not just talking about a tangible thing like a heart rate monitor, but it could be an exercise program, it could be a concept, it could be something like CrossFit, which kind of tries to encompass all of these different things. It's anytime something is potentially sold to the consumer. And this is the only study that I'm aware of that has really looked at the mismatch between claims and evidence. And this was published in the British Medical Journal back in 2012, I believe it was. And they looked at over 100 different sports-related products. So drinks and shoes and so forth. And they also looked at more than 400 different performance-enhancing claims that were related to the products. Now, more than half of those claims were unsupported by any kind of evidence. And as humanists, as scientists and skeptics and critical thinkers, evidence is quite important to us. So this is a bit of a problem. And when evidence was provided to support the claim, what they also found was that 85% of those references were at a really high risk of bias, which means they were low quality studies, small sample sizes, and usually with some kind of conflict of interest. What they concluded in this study was that there is a striking lack of evidence to support the vast majority of sports products that make claims related to enhanced performance or recovery. So what we're seeing is a huge disparity between the claims for health and fitness products and the evidence in support of those claims. So let's come back and talk about cupping, because we mentioned cupping at the start, and Michael Phelps's unwitting endorsement of cupping really started a trend, certainly in swimming, and we'll talk later about his followers on social media. He's got many millions of them. So when an elite athlete endorses a product like this, it really has meaning. Now, cupping specifically can be split into both dry cupping and wet cupping. You can see in these GIFs on the right-hand side that cupping involves using glass cups that are placed on the skin at sites of injury or soreness. And then there's a suction that's created inside the cup, either using a heated mechanism or some kind of suction device, as you can see down here. Now, in dry cupping, the idea is that it stimulates energy flow, and I put that in quotes on purpose. And in wet cupping, it's kind of the same idea, but they will actually make a small incision to bleed the area. Yes, this is bloodletting to remove stagnant blood and toxins. And something like this is, of course, an alternative therapy, and the research suggests that somewhere between 50 to 80% of athletes use alternative therapies. And cupping, really, when you look at the plausibility from a scientific perspective, certainly as a physiologist, is energy medicine. It's completely implausible, and there's no mechanism as to how cupping should or could actually work. And this is energy medicine in much the same way as homeopathy is, acupuncture, and Reiki. To believe that these practices are effective, you have to literally believe in magic. And you might be surprised to see acupuncture in there, because a lot of people think that acupuncture is a more mainstream, more legitimate therapy. And really, that's just a testament to how acupuncture has been snuck into mainstream practice. Most physiotherapists around the world will be happy to give you acupuncture, but it's very definitely an alternative therapy based on ancient Chinese medicine. Of course, as scientists, skeptics, critical thinkers, we have to look at the evidence. This is one review study of many that I could have picked that shows that cupping on the whole is indistinguishable from placebo. And when I say placebo, you probably know that I mean expectation and belief type effects. So it might work for some people because they expect it to work and they believe that it's going to work, but that's not the same thing as it having a real physical effect on the body. Cupping is, as I've said, an alternative therapy, and alternative therapies tend to have three main characteristics. They are underpinned by strong claims and weak evidence. They tend to invoke science-sounding terms. We call this blinding with science. That's an informal logical fallacy. Lots of complex, sophisticated science-sounding terms are used to lend false legitimacy to the product. And the third characteristic is that they tend to be underpinned by low-quality evidence, as I've mentioned before. Small samples, usually lacking control groups, and often published in journals that are sympathetic to alternative medicine. But the problem that we have here is that we're not always dealing with homeopathy or cupping or Reiki. You know, that's debunking these therapies is a little bit like shooting fish in a barrel. Most health and fitness products are not complementary and alternative medicine. So let's talk about something like K-tape or kinesiology tape. If you watch a lot of sport, or certainly if you watch the Olympic Games, you'll have seen K-tape on display quite heavily. It was developed in the 1970s by Kenzo Casey, who was incidentally a chiropractor. I'm not sure that's necessarily relevant, but I think it's interesting. And K-tape really became popular because of donations and sponsorship, which raised the profile of the product. This is the same strategy that they're using today. It's not really underpinned by much evidence, but they sponsor high-level athletes, and people see that K-tape is very prevalent. They see it a lot, it's very visible. And because of this ingrained bias that we have called the exposure effect, we assume that K-tape must be popular or even effective because we happen to see it everywhere. Of course, whether it's effective or not has to be judged on merit. Now, taping is decades old, and it's largely effective for supporting injured muscles and joints. But manufacturers of K-tape make these additional claims. One manufacturer suggests that K-tape is effective by lifting the skin, which optimizes the flow of lymphatic fluids to transport white blood cells and help remove waste products, cellular debris, and bacteria. Now, again, this is more blinding with science. It sounds very sciencey and intellectual, but really these are sort of nonsense words and really not supported by the evidence. When we look at the studies on K-tape, I've picked 3 review articles. These are systematic reviews that have been published in I guess, relatively recently. And they all pretty much conclude the same thing. There are very few, if any, good, high-quality studies to support the use of K-tape. There is no benefit beyond that achieved with normal taping, and there is almost certainly a perceived benefit or a placebo effect on behalf of the athlete. So taping might be beneficial. K-tape is no better. It's certainly not superior to normal tape. What about barefoot running? And these are a few kind of random examples, but I think they are great case studies because they allow us to sort of sharpen our critical faculties, and we can explore these things in a little bit more detail. So barefoot running owes its current popularity to Chris McDougall's book, Born to Run. And barefoot running really is this idea of, it's not really barefoot, it's an oxymoron. It's actually minimalist running shoes, not using a sole on the bottom of the foot. It's marketed largely on a logical fallacy, one that we call the appeal to tradition, and or the appeal to antiquity. It's this idea that something is better or correct because it correlates with some past traditional practice. And manufacturers of barefoot running shoes will use slogans like "run like your ancient Paleolithic ancestors," "run like your hunter-gatherer ancestors." This idea that that's, you know, that somehow gives a legitimacy or merit to the product. It does promote a forefoot strike, and proponents of barefoot running suggest that barefoot running can actually reduce the risk of injury, because by using modern day, very sort of cushioned running shoes, the lower limbs have become deconditioned to the stresses and strains of modern day life. So actually promoting a forefoot strike might reduce the injury risk. But again, we need to look at the evidence, we need to look at the literature. And when we do so, this is one review that I found, again, fairly recent. And it's a review of 53 studies on injury risk, found no benefit of barefoot running shoes. So again, it's marketed on a logical fallacy. The claims are relatively plausible, but they don't stand up to scrutiny. And lastly, in this section, I want to talk about protein, because protein is really ubiquitous with the modern health and fitness industry. Even exercise science researchers can't stop talking about protein. So let's talk about what protein is and what it isn't. Protein is made up of long-chain amino acids, and it's important for cell growth and repair. And amino acids are also important for immune function. So protein really is an important aspect. It's an important macronutrient and makes up an important part of a healthy diet. But it's certainly not a magical macronutrient. It won't make you thin. It won't increase your muscle mass without you doing some exercise as well. There's a lot of what we call bro science in this domain, the kind of science that you might hear from your friend at the gym. This idea that if you consume too much protein, that it just goes straight through the body and it'll be excreted out in urine, for example. So that's complete nonsense, this idea that it can't turn to fat if it's overconsumed. There are very clear metabolic pathways that convert excess amino acids into fatty acids on the body, and you can store them as adipose tissue. So that's a nonsense claim. Generally, most active individuals need somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 grams of protein per kilo per day. As far as I'm concerned, that's it. You know, it doesn't get more complicated than that, but it's important to understand what protein is and what protein isn't, because there are lots of additional unsupported, illegitimate claims that are based around protein and sports supplements in general. But here's the other problem, is that there are some products and practices in health and fitness that make some very plausible, very legitimate claims and conflate them with implausible claims. And for people who are not, you know, really avid exercisers or not exercise scientists, may struggle to distinguish between them. So I'm going to talk about yoga here. And full disclosure, I think yoga is a great practice. I've done it myself a number of times over the years. And a short anecdote, I was in a Bikram yoga class a few years ago, And I was doing a stretch whereby I was sitting on the floor. I had one leg straight out in front of me. I had the other leg kind of folded over, and I'm hugging my knee towards my chest. And this is kind of a well-known stretch for the glutes and kind of the lower back. And the yoga instructor is walking around the room, and in this very kind of calm, relaxing tone of voice says, now this stretch is very good for the gluteal muscles and the lower back. And it will help to relieve tension in this area. It will also boost the immune system, and it will improve your liver function. And I'm still holding this stretch, and with one hand, I'm scratching my head, because I was with him on the first two parts of that, because I can feel the stretch working. But immune boosting, liver squeezing stretches are where I tend to draw the line. And yoga is known for this, meditation as well, because they often conflate the plausible and implausible claims. Some of the plausible claims and evidence-based claims of yoga are that it's effective for weight loss. A lot of people lose a lot of weight doing yoga, which is great. You can improve your flexibility and your core strength. That's mainly why I was doing it. It can help reduce anxiety, primarily because of the meditative aspects of yoga practice. There are, of course, social benefits as well. But some of the additional claims that are made that are implausible, that we get this increased energy flow, this idea that there's some kind of chi energy, a life force, so to speak. This idea that it can promote healing. We're getting on very thin ice when we talk about a particular activity that can promote healing. This idea that it boosts immunity. We see this claim throughout the health and fitness industry, this idea that you can do something that boosts your immunity, and actually you can't boost your immunity. You can strengthen your immunity by eating well and getting enough sleep and exercising regularly, but you can't actually boost your immunity in the short term. This idea that hot yoga aids the muscles by increasing their core temperature isn't supported by research. And there's also this idea that yoga is somehow better than other practices. It's a great exercise, but it's not necessarily better than other forms. So this is a prime example of plausible and implausible claims, and we've got to teach people to be better critical thinkers so that they can distinguish between science and pseudoscience, not just in health and fitness, but in all aspects of society. So if there are so many bunk claims, all of these implausible, legitimate claims in health and fitness, why do we fall for them? Surely we should be, smart enough and intelligent enough to be able to distinguish between the plausible and the implausible claim. Why do we fall for them so frequently? Well, we can start to understand this, but it's a very complex subject. But one of the primary reasons that we fall for these sort of quick fix modalities is because of evolutionary history. Now, humans evolved for economy of movement, economy of thought. And when we are faced with any kind of complex decision, we employ these effort reduction principles, these kind of mental shortcuts called heuristics. And these economy heuristics served us very well. They were very important to us when we were hunter-gatherers, and we needed to conserve calories, and we needed to predict the migration patterns of animals and weather patterns and so forth. But modern society has changed dramatically in the last 50 to 100 years, particularly the last 50 years since the advent of the internet and social media. And human genes and human lives are now incongruous. And we are trying to make decisions in a modern day health and fitness industry, in modern day society that is underpinned by fake news, social media, and bad science. And we are trying to do this with sort of outdated critical faculties. So our ingrained critical faculties are not really up to the task. And this is why we tend to fall for these one quick fix interventions, these glossy before and after images, the weird fruit that doctors don't want you to know about, one weird trick for busting belly fat. We know sort of at the back of our minds, we know that this is too good to be true, but we find it inherently attractive because we all want this shortcut. We all want to expedite our health and fitness goals. But if you take nothing else away from this talk, I want you to take this next point away. This is probably the crucial one-liner. And that is that marketing companies know our biases better than we do. And they specifically design their marketing strategies to exploit our biases in order to make a sale. And I'll give you some examples. Here are some logical fallacies that are exploited by product marketing campaigns. So the first one is the appeal to tradition. I've mentioned this already in relation to barefoot running, but we can also use it in reference to the paleo diet. Eat like your Paleolithic ancestors did. Barefoot running, run like your hunter-gatherer ancestors. Traditional medicines are often advertised on the idea that they've been used for thousands of years. I don't care how long they've been used for. I want to know if they work. And that's, as critical thinkers and as skeptics, that's kind of the question that we need to be asking. But it's, again, this ingrained fallacy, this ingrained bias that we tend to assume, sort of subconsciously almost, that something that has been around for a long time must be efficacious. There is the appeal to nature. Now, this logical fallacy is exploited probably most commonly throughout the health and fitness industry. The entire organic food industry more or less hinges on the appeal to nature. It is this idea that something that is natural is somehow better or superior to something that is unnatural. And so that sort of is related to our bias for natural produce. Anytime you see this term free from chemicals, they are committing this logical fallacy, because we see free from chemicals on all different types of food products. I saw an advert, a commercial for makeup the other day that was free from chemicals. Well, if you know anything about science, you'll know that if something is free from chemicals, then it doesn't exist, because everything is made from chemicals. But the phrasing that is employed here really cuts to the core of that bias. And then the last example that I'll give, that I could have picked very many, is the argument from authority. So anytime you see athletes advertising a product, the branding that is associated with high-performance athletes, endorsements from experts as well, it's very difficult, because sometimes there is a legitimate expert that is endorsing a product, and sometimes the expert isn't necessary. Sometimes the expert isn't a legitimate expert. So, for example, if you see Usain Bolt advertising running shoes, well, of course, the most successful and the most famous sprinter of all time, is he necessarily an expert in all types of running shoes? That's a different question. Now, the other thing to consider is advertising and sponsorship. This, I guess, is the other main reason why people tend to fall for the unsupported claims of marketing companies. I've got a few images on the left here. You may or may not have noticed the incessant branding that we're being bombarded with on a day-to-day basis. McElroy, an American triathlete, of course, is sponsored by K-Tig, which we spoke about earlier. Usain Bolt sponsored by Puma. This is a screenshot from some NFL broadcasting, and you can see the logos and the adverts pasted all over the place. And this is a great thing for athletes, because athletes tend to have very large social media followings. They don't earn a lot of money. In the US, if you win a gold medal, I think you win somewhere between $40,000 and $45,000, which is a great lump sum, but it's not exactly enough to retire on. Most athletes don't win gold medals. And the Olympics only come around every 4 years. In the United Kingdom, you don't win any prize money for winning a medal. So you can win 15 gold medals, and it's the only revenue that you're going to get, that you're going to be able to generate, is through sponsorship. So this is a great thing for athletes. But it has implications for society, because when athletes leverage their social media following to sell product, it tends to pioneer population trends in those particular products. Now, we are using social media and digital media more and more nowadays. There's this study here, a really big study that looked at decades of data. I don't know if you can read that, but I'll read you the conclusion. Compared with previous generations, they termed the current generation iGen teens in the 2010s spend more time online and less time with older media such as books, magazines, and TV. Time on digital media, and it's particularly social media, appears to have displaced time once spent reading and watching TV. So we're spending more time on digital and particularly social media. It's a great thing for athletes. But again, this comes with complications, because when we think about the influence or the reach that these athletes have compared to the influence or reach that science communicators have, for example, you'll see that actually we're heavily outgunned. So I'll ask everybody in the audience and everybody watching at home, just bring to mind 3 or 4 of the most famous or prominent science communicators that you can think of. Just bring to mind 3 to 4. And I'm sure most of you immediately thought of Neil deGrasse Tyson. And if you combine his Instagram and Twitter following, he has about 16 million followers, which is pretty good going for a science communicator. And I can't think of a more well-known scientist or science communicator than Neil deGrasse Tyson. You may also have thought of Bill Nye the Science Guy. Again, if you combine his Instagram and Twitter followers, he's got about 9 million. Professor Alice Roberts, very big in the United Kingdom. I don't know if she's very well known overseas, but she is sort of integrated with the British Humanist Foundation, and she's got approaching 400,000 followers. And of course, Richard Dawkins has around 3 million followers, most of them on Twitter. He's not very big on Instagram, as you can probably imagine. So that sort of suggests that scientists and science communicators tend to have quite a lot of reach. Again, I've just picked 4 here. But let's think of some very famous, prominent athletes. So Simone Biles, for example, has about 9 million followers. Okay, science communicators are holding their own here in terms of their messaging. But if we bring Serena Williams into the mix, then she has the same number of followers as all of our 4 most prominent science communicators altogether. And again, our science communicators are propagating this message of science and reason and critical thinking, whereas athletes are often using their social media followings to generate revenue through sponsorship. And if we talk about Cristiano Ronaldo, he's up at 400, the most famous soccer player in the world, 430 million followers. And so we see here that science communicators have really brought a knife to a gunfight when it comes to influence on digital media. And this is a problem because somebody like Cristiano Ronaldo is constantly selling product through his social media. You can see him here advertising supplements, some kind of massage gun, running sneakers, abdominal muscle stimulators. I remember seeing adverts for these back in the 80s when I was a kid, and the technology I don't think has really come along a great deal since then, and they're still advertising these things. And yes, this is a validated statistic. Cristiano Ronaldo made around $50 million just through Instagram last year through product sponsorship. And so it's easy to see how elite athletes are pioneering population trends in the use of all types of products and practices, particularly alternative therapies. So that's enough problematizing the issue. What are the implications? Well, first and foremost, complementary and alternative medicine, we started talking about cupping, is risky. I've blurred this image just for the squeamish among you. And there are many scientific reports, and you can see more mainstream media publications. We're talking about some of the side effects and some of the risks of alternative therapy. There are many deaths that have been associated with chiropractic, cupping-related burns, death from acupuncture, and of course, all medical interventions come with a benefit to risk ratio, and the physician is trained to sort of make a judgment call on the relative benefits and risks. But of course, with complementary and alternative medicine, the benefits hinge on placebo, on an imagined benefit. So the risks really don't seem possible to justify here. So that's the first implication, is that there is risk of overt harm from using these practices. The other thing to consider is that pseudoscience breeds pseudoscience. Placebo products are used across the health and fitness industry, but it's impossible to restrict the use of placebo products to health and fitness. Sooner or later, it's going to contaminate clinical practice because somebody is going to use acupuncture or cupping therapy to treat something potentially serious. The British Cupping Association, on the one hand, say that cupping can be used to relieve muscle soreness. That's why most athletes use it. They also suggest that it can be used to treat asthma-like symptoms. Again, we're on very thin ice here. We can see the same with cryotherapy. LeBron James using the cryotherapy chamber here on the bottom left. Again, some proponents claim that it can relieve muscle soreness and boost your immune system. Other people claim that it can cure illness and disease. So this is a problem. And this is why we see time after time these very tragic instances in the media and again in the scientific literature of people using placebo medicine to treat something that needs a real medical intervention. And we see this, we're seeing this play out in the pandemic with unevidence-based interventions. The other thing to consider is the effect that unproven and ineffective products can have on population health. So we've mentioned the pandemic already, but there's another pandemic going on, that's the obesity pandemic. So the increasing worldwide incidence of obesity is predicted by 2030 to be 1 in 2 Americans that are obese, 1 in 3 Europeans, and the Europeans are quickly catching up with the Americans. And you can see here, even in the kind of the yellow states, they still have a 1/3 prevalence of obesity. Obesity is an ongoing problem. It has a huge health burden and an economic burden as well. Now, to combat weight issues, a lot of people turn to fad diets, the keto diet, paleo, Atkins, and people tend to lose a little bit of weight when they start a new diet, but the studies show that in the long term, 1 and 2 year follow-ups, fad diets don't work. They're not sustainable in the long term. And weight regain is generally the rule, with 1/3 to 2/3 of the weight lost being regained within 1 year, and almost all of the weight is regained within 5 years. Okay, so these fad diets are not effective at evoking long-term weight loss. And the extent of the problem is really poorly illustrated in these very glossy, flashy before and after images that you'll see all over Instagram. They tend to show this part of the equation, the before and after image, when somebody's tried this crash weight loss diet, they've lost a lot of weight, gone through this dramatic bodily transformation, but then within a year, certainly within 2 years, they've regained most of the weight that they've lost, and sometimes even more. They never show the after image with a fad diet. Of course, people are losing weight and getting in shape, and there are instances of dramatic transformations, but very rarely is it sustainable with a fad diet. So people tend to bounce from one fad diet to the next. This is termed yo-yo dieting. So they try a diet, they lose a bit of weight, they regain most of the weight that they've lost or even more. They try another diet, they lose a bit of weight, and the cycle continues. It's yo-yo dieting, or sometimes called weight cycling. Not only does this not evoke long-term health and long-term weight loss, but it has an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, particularly in women, and it is associated with negative psychological and behavioral consequences as well. Studies show increased risk for psychopathology, life dissatisfaction, and binge eating when people are engaging in this kind of yo-yo dieting. So it's a real problem across the board, and people who are investing time and effort and money in unproven therapies really are, this is not long-term sustainable, and they're not going to have they're not standing the best chance of achieving their long-term health and wellness goals. So how do we combat this then? We've talked about the implications. How do we combat this? How do we get people to engage in more effective treatments and strategies and therapies? And of course, this won't be a surprise to you, it's through critical thinking. Yes, debunking myths and misinformation, that's a lot of fun, but that isn't always effective. Sometimes it does more harm than good if a belief is particularly entrenched. That's why pre-bunking is important. We all know somebody who doesn't listen to reason. We've all got an uncle or a friend who has opted not to get vaccinated. We all know people who insist on following the keto diet, even though it's not getting them long-term results. We all know people that are religious fanatics, and no amount of logical reason can sway them from their path. To quote Jonathan Swift, you can't. What's the quote? I've got to get it right now. You can't use reason to move somebody out of a position that they didn't first reason themselves into. And I think that's really relevant here, because sometimes if you throw all of this data and information at somebody and you go through this process of myth busting and fact checking, sometimes it does more harm than good. So pre-bunking is this idea of teaching people to distinguish between science and pseudoscience early on, getting them to understand how to think rather than what to think. And this is something that needs to be integrated at school. Yes, college and university, but it's got to be integrated at school so that we can develop adults who have good, well-sharpened critical thinking faculties that they can apply regardless of their chosen career and vocation. And I have spent the last decade or so trying to get critical thinking, particularly critical thinking about health, integrated into college and university and also at school so that we can get graduates with well-rounded critical faculties. How we do that, really, it's a very complex and difficult issue, and maybe that requires a new talk altogether. So just to summarize then, as I bring things to a close, health and fitness is big business, as you know. It thrives on cognitive biases and scientific illiteracy, and there are broad implications for clinical practice and also population health. Fortunately, there's a way to navigate it smoothly, and that is through scientific skepticism and critical thinking. Now, I always like to finish with a quote, and no better person to quote from than James the Amazing Randi. No amount of belief makes something of fact. And we can all sympathize and empathize with that statement. It's relevant not just in the commercial health and wellness industry, which is underpinned, it hinges on placebo products, but in all facets of society. I think this quote is applicable. So we're just about at 40 minutes, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. I'll just say thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention. If you'd like to follow me on social media, I'm only really on Twitter, and you can find out more about the work I'm doing at my website, nbtiller.com. So thank you once again for your time. I hope you found it of interest, and I will hand back to Carrie for some questions.
Thank you, Nick, for that eye-opening talk. We will have our Q&A in just a few minutes, so you can start thinking about your questions now. First, we'll enjoy a musical interlude during which we invite you to donate to the Ethical Humanist Society. It is through our generosity that we show how meaningful these Sunday programs are. A donation of $5 or any amount that you're comfortable with is greatly appreciated. Contributions are being collected in the basket. You can use the QR codes if you're in the building, and the link is being put on YouTube right now. So thank you to all who sustain the society with your donations of time and money. We now invite questions from the audience. So people who are in person can come to that microphone to ask questions. And then I'm also getting the questions from YouTube on my phone. So we'll intersperse and I'll ask the YouTube questions as well. Questions should be brief and phrased as questions and not as comments, as a courtesy to others. And we'll get to as many questions as possible. So we'll start with Katie.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk. I guess a thing I worry about, I'm a health policy researcher, and I'm a big fan of science and data. The thing that I worry about and is being aware that we don't know everything. Like that 100 years ago, the guy who had the big idea that was really smart had solved the thing that no one understood. And now we look back and go, I can't believe they thought that stupid thing. We've learned so much, right? And so I kind of always am sobered by thinking that people in 100 years or whatever number of years are going to look back and go, are you kidding? I can't believe they thought that was a good idea. And so we're as smart as we are, which is great, but we're also probably really ignorant about a lot of things. And I worry about the certainty with which scientists are forced to talk, given the need to be clear, right? At a time when I think even really smart big thinkers would say, except for we don't know a lot. And I don't know how to juxtapose this sort of existential uncertainty that surrounds everything with the need to sound certain in the context of the things you're talking about.
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you for the question. It's something that I've also battled with a lot, because you're absolutely right, particularly in the current climate, we need scientists and we need health experts to speak with a degree of certainty and authority. Again, let's talk about, vaccine efficacy and so forth, because if there is any uncertainty, then people will jump on this, and people can very easily take things out of context nowadays. I think the key thing about science is that it doesn't promote certainty. Any good scientist really has to have doubt ingrained into them. And we're constantly doubting the efficacy of particular products and particular practices. And if you look at the phrasing that is used in any scientific journal article, if there's a clinical study on a new drug, or in exercise science, for example, there'll be an exercise modality that shows that exercising this way has more of an effect on blood pressure, for example. And you'll always see in the conclusions, our data suggest that. It's very rarely more definitive. I guess it's very rarely more definite than that. And if it is, the reviewer of the paper, before it gets published, will have to address the phrasing that's used, because this is just one study, for example, and then we can look at the scientific consensus, and then we can say, according to our understanding, this is how things work. So based on our best available evidence, this is how things work. And that's kind of all that we can do in science. So I think, yes, there is the need to sound confident and to speak with some degree of authority, particularly with health-related matters. If we're ever, we have to be open-minded and don't dismiss anything out of turn. And that's why the scientific process, the Socratic method, is so important, because we don't dismiss something because it's an alternative therapy. We don't dismiss cupping because it's an alternative therapy. We don't dismiss acupuncture because it's an ancient Chinese medicine. We don't dismiss homeopathy because it's energy medicine. We dismiss it because it's been tested and it doesn't work according to our understanding of science. And we can use a God analogy here. What's the difference between a medicine that has no observable effect on the body and no medicine at all, right? So according to our understanding of how the body works, these alternative therapies don't work. They don't have an effect on the body. So that's why we dismiss them. We don't dismiss them because they're alternative therapies. We dismiss them because that's what the evidence suggests we should do. And there are much more efficacious things that we should spend our time on. But very complicated, very complex questions to try and answer. But hopefully I've at least scratched the surface.
Well, I guess this could be considered sort of a follow-on to that question, but I mean, obviously, these things don't work any better than placebos, but it's well established that placebos work too. It's all psychological, but if you believe it works, especially in athletics, where sort of your confidence and your feeling about how you're performing can be very important, a psychological boost. So I would imagine that many of these people trying these various alternative things, for them, they do work, and they feel that they do work. So how do you, or is it even worth combating this? How do you combat the notion that, oh, it works for me?
Yeah, I guess it's how do we consolidate those two things? This idea that you rightly say that placebo has very powerful psychobiological effects on the body. And particularly in elite performance, this can be the difference between winning and losing, between gold and silver. And so it can't be dismissed out of turn. And actually, when you look at the data in surveys that have been done on athletes and elite athletes, the vast majority of them respond by saying, when they're asked if they would mind using a placebo-related product, if it meant that they had to be deceived by their coach into using it, most of them would say they wouldn't mind if they felt that it would improve their performance. So they wouldn't mind their coaches giving them a product that the coach knew was a placebo, that it didn't have any physical effect on the body, if they knew that it would give them a positive psychological edge. Most athletes wouldn't mind being deceived by their coach. And we have very similar data in patients. Most patients, when surveyed, say that they don't mind their doctor prescribing them a placebo medicine if, as long as they believe that it's working, then to some extent it's working. Problem that we have, and I sort of tried to explore this in the talk, is that philosophy is wonderful if you're using placebo products to treat a bit of lower back pain or to treat a benign headache, or for sports performance, whereby if an athlete doesn't, break their personal best in the marathon, or they don't, jump the highest or run the fastest, it's not the end of the world, but it's a slippery slope because it's impossible to restrict placebo medicine just for these minor medical ailments. And as I showed in the talk, there are many instances where people use placebo medicine or energy medicine to treat something that was really serious, and it can have tragic consequences. So I suppose what we have to do is have that conversation. What are the implications? Understand the implications. And it's been suggested that perhaps in sport, the happy medium, if you like, is for athletes to use products that have physical effects on the body, but also have very powerful expectation effects. So caffeine is an example of that. Caffeine is a stimulant. It has a real effect on the mind and body. But most athletes, if you gave them some caffeine, or if you gave them a pill and told them it was caffeine, they would anticipate that it would improve their performance. So it has both the psychological or psychosomatic effect, and it has the physiological effect. And that way we get the best of both worlds without necessarily having to compromise our intellectual integrity. But yeah, good question.
Thank you so much for your talk. I had a question just about the diets that you were talking about. I guess I had two questions. One is if the yo-yo pattern that you were describing is worse than, say, a control group not doing anything. And I don't know if that's been studied directly. And then also the advice of don't do those diets leaves me feeling sort of unsatisfied if I want to lose weight, in terms of like, then what is scientifically proven to be effective, if anything.
Okay, well, the first part of your question, I don't think we have the data to be able to to come to that conclusion. So I guess to reframe your question, is yo-yo dieting better or worse for your cardiovascular health in the long term than not doing anything? That I don't know. It's a very good question. What we do know is that physical activity is preventative in all-cause mortality. And we know that if somebody is overweight, then that increases their risk of cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, and certain cancers. So what we have to be doing is striving to reduce body fat, reduce body mass, if you like, through increased physical activity, generally, by moving more, and not necessarily eating less, but eating better. To get to the second part of your question, it's the hardest thing in the world for me to sit here and to do other talks and to write papers on this idea of not following a diet. Because people think, well, so I shouldn't diet because that's how you lose weight. And therein lies the problem. As soon as I wrote in Skeptical Inquirer recently, this idea that your diet will never work because diets and other short-term interventions like detoxes, they have transients built into their architecture. So this whole idea of starting a diet and kind of jumping on the wagon, as soon as you create that wagon, you're at risk of falling off it, right? And this is when we get yo-yo dieting. People start a diet, and diets are premised on you restricting yourself of certain foods or denying yourself of certain foods. And that's not sustainable in the long term. Sooner or later, you're going to fall off the wagon, and this is when we get the yo-yo effect. And the whole commercial health and fitness industry hinges on this idea that there is a quick fix, that there is a diet you can try, there is a supplement you can take, there is an exercise that you can do that is going to expedite your health and fitness goals. The only thing that is proven to work, that is shown to work time and time again, is to make long-term sustainable changes. So that doesn't mean going on a diet. It doesn't mean following a particular commercial intervention for a short period. It doesn't mean necessarily restricting yourself to only eating healthy foods, because if you're restricting yourself, the very notion that you're restricting yourself means that sooner or later you're going to be not restricting yourself, and then you're going to start binge eating, and that's when we get the yo-yo effect. So it's the hardest thing to do, and sometimes it needs, interventions from behavioral psychologists or dietitians or nutritionists, professionals, but it needs a long-term change in lifestyle so that on a day-to-day basis, you are just eating healthily. It's not a diet, it's just healthy eating. So that on a day-to-day basis, sustainably in the long term, you are just exercising more. So I can honestly say that I think 5 to 6 days a week, I do exercise. Not because I'm trying to lose weight or to stay in shape or anything like this. It's just because it's part of my routine. It's part of what I do. Just like you get up every morning and you brush your teeth without thinking about it, we need to ingrain these healthy habits into our long-term lifestyle. So it's sustainable. That's the only thing that has been shown in studies to be long-term sustainable and long-term effective. So it's this idea of anytime there's a diet, has transients in its architecture. So we've got to move away from diets and move towards just long-term, sustainable, healthy habits. It's much easier said than done. I understand that, but we've got to try. Thank you for the question.
All right, I've got a number of questions from the YouTube audience. People in the in-person audience, feel free to just still go over there and we can alternate. But here's a YouTube question. Do you have ideas of how to increase or do you have ideas of how to introduce and increase critical thinking skills in school and society and in general? I broke him.
Yes, so this really, to get it introduced in schools and colleges, it really needs some kind of federal intervention to change the curriculum. And that is something that, I've been pushing for a long time. It's going to need a bigger campaign. The problem that we have is that in schools, there is a set curriculum and teachers are under a lot of strain. A couple of my friends are teachers and they work so hard. And they have a very limited amount of time to teach a lot of subjects and to get the full content of the curriculum. taught and kind of sent across in class. And so this is a very, very difficult thing to do, getting federal intervention to change the curriculum and add to the curriculum when it's already packed and when teachers are already, so under strain, is a very difficult thing to do. But it's absolutely crucial, I think, because it seems to me that the broader society don't really see the relevance or the importance of critical thinking. They don't see how that it underpins every decision that we make. Not just, this goes beyond health and fitness. This is about making smart decisions in contemporary society. And this is a contemporary society, which I mentioned at the start, is underpinned by fake news, social media, and bad science. And to be able to make smart decisions, we have to have critical thinking. So it needs a federal intervention first and foremost. It's a little bit easier to do at college and university. It has to be done at this level before people reach adulthood, because by the time people are adults, their ideas are a little bit more fixed, a little bit less malleable, a little bit harder to reach. Of course, people can still make a change, but the education needs to come in much earlier on. And it's easier to do at college and universities because for the most part, teachers and lecturers and college professors design their own curriculum. But even in the science disciplines, we see how critical thinking really is not included. We assume that being a scientist and they're not. You get a lot of very high-level scientists who are wonderful scientists and who are critical thinkers when it comes to their very narrow domain of research, for example. But if you shift them just a little bit out of their domain of expertise, their critical faculties crumble. And this is when we get medical doctors who are also homeopaths, for example, right? They're not critical thinkers. And this is, it's rarer to see this, but sometimes you get, astrophysicists or astronomers who are also into astrology. It's very rare, but it does happen. I got an email from somebody a little while ago who was an astrophysicist who was trying to convince me that the movement of the moon, the human body, but because of the gravitational effect that it exerts on the high water content of the body is upwards of 70% water, and they were trying to convince me that that the moon would have an effect on human behavior. And this has been widely debunked. And this is an astrophysicist, right? So if they can fall for these kinds of pseudosciences, then anyone can. So we need to get critical thinking integrated into colleges and universities, and that's a much easier thing to do because we can design the curriculum ourselves. And even in research methods, I don't know if anybody who's watching, if they've done a science degree or they've done higher education in science, they'll have done classes in research methods. It teaches you how to design studies to minimize bias, but it doesn't teach you how to make good evidence-based decisions in broader society. And I think that's where the emphasis needs to be a little bit more.
What are your thoughts on why the insurance industry supports homeopathic, chiropractic, and acupuncture treatments if they're largely ineffective?
Yes, and I was posed a similar question a little while ago. And that was also a live event. It was a radio show, and the listener called in and asked why are our healthcare providers funding acupuncture if it doesn't work? And we saw a similar thing in the United Kingdom, so where I'm from originally. The National Health Service there put tens of millions of pounds into a homeopathy hospital in Harley Street. They did this for the longest time, but only in the last couple of years have they stopped funding the practice. And homeopathy really is that really is shooting fish in a barrel. If we're only just at the point now where we're able to kind of say with homeopathy work, and federal agencies are backing us on this, then that's a sad state of affairs because we've got all these other practices. I think to answer the question, why are they funded? Well, I think it probably comes down to the placebo effect. One of the reasons that homeopathy, again, to come back to this example, one of the reasons it's so popular is because when you go and see your physician. I don't know what the statistics are in the US. In the UK, you get on average 8 minutes with your primary care provider. So when you a one-to-one consultation, that's not a very long time. If you go and see a homeopathic doctor, then you can double or triple that amount of time because they've got the bandwidth to do it. And you almost always come away from a homeopathic doctor with some kind of prescription. You feel a little bit better. And for minor medical ailments, that is a real resource, particularly on a health system that is under strain and that is particularly burdened in, again, in modern times. So placebo medicine, it is effective for minor medical ailments when people can convince themselves that they feel a bit better. And it does take the burden off the healthcare system. Again, the problem that we have is when somebody tries to use placebo medicine to treat something that needs a real medical intervention. And that's the slippery slope that we've got to try and balance. We've got to try and consolidate those two views.
Do you have any advice for how to effectively provide scientific evidence to someone who deeply believes in Reiki or other unscientific practices?
Yeah, great question. If somebody has a belief that is really entrenched and it's really ingrained, then don't provide them with any scientific evidence. Don't provide them with the facts, because all you will do is push them away and they will shut down. They'll double down. And we see this time and time again. You've got to know your audience, because sometimes if you present the facts and figures to the right individuals, if they're a little bit on the fence, then you can persuade them. And if somebody is data-minded, if they are reasonable, then of course have that conversation. But if a belief is really entrenched, then don't bother. All you're going to do is push them further away. When this is the case, there are better and more sophisticated strategies that we can use. So one of those examples is something called defeasibility. And I kind of describe this as, rather than trying to change somebody's mind, you encourage them to change their own mind. And the way that you do that is by sowing some seeds. And you ask some very simple questions. So if somebody is, the question was relating to Reiki, ask the individual, what would it take to undermine your belief in Reiki? What would you have to see? What evidence would you have to see? What would you have to experience for your views and opinions on Reiki to be overturned? And sometimes they'll say to you, nothing will ever overturn my belief in Reiki. Even if I had a bad experience, I would never change my mind. And you hear this a lot about, with same question about religion. What would it take for you to undermine your belief in an all-powerful deity? And somebody will say, well, I'll never, because even if I saw some evidence that contradicted my beliefs, it's just that's a test of faith, right? So if somebody answers that way, then you know that their beliefs are not malleable. So to a certain extent, you're wasting your time. But sometimes they'll respond to you with something like, well, if I had a personal experience that was very negative, if I went to a Reiki practitioner and my back pain didn't get better or my headaches got worse, that might get me to think twice. If a really good friend of mine had a negative experience, if my Reiki practitioner opened up about some of the, placebo effects and wasn't as confident and wasn't as definite about the positive effects, that might get me to think twice. And maybe you just leave the conversation there and just let those seeds start to blossom and come back to the conversation. The whole point of defeasibility is to try and cleave just a little bit of room for doubt. Again, if these beliefs are really entrenched, don't try and change somebody's mind, because they'll shut down. Okay, it's an ego thing. Nobody wants to be proven wrong. And that goes for scientists, not people on the good and bad side of the debate. Nobody wants to be told that they're wrong. Confirmation bias. But if you can just cleave a little bit of room for doubt, get people to start questioning their own beliefs, then sometimes that's all you can do, and sometimes that's enough, and you can come back and have the conversation again, allow those seeds to sprout and blossom. But yes, more often than not, if a belief is very entrenched, facts and figures are going to do more harm than good. So we've got to be a little bit more subtle. Feasibility is one way of doing that, and more kind of broader pre-bunking, broader education and critical thinking, so that we can teach people how to think rather than what to think before they learn those beliefs to begin with. Very briefly, inoculation theory is another one. It's kind of exposing people to flawed arguments and flawed products and practices early on, so they can kind of develop them later on in life. That's got to be introduced early on. A great question. It's a real problem that we face in health and fitness, but across the board.
Hi, thank you for a very informative talk. I have a heart condition, and I was advised some years ago to stick with a low-fat diet. Now, I know that over the subsequent years, especially I know because my sister is a dairy farmer, so every time there's a bit of research that seems to show that dairy fat is not necessarily so bad for people with heart conditions, I hear about it. But the American Heart Association is still saying to stick with a low-fat diet. And I guess my question is, those of us who want to get the best research and the best advice that's available at any time, are there sources for health issues to go to where we will get the best possible advice?
Sorry, I seem to have lost the connection for a moment there, but appear to be back now.
Yes, the question, to paraphrase what Sue asked, was, do you have advice about where we can look to find reliable health and medical information as, lay people who aren't necessarily reading the studies? Where can you direct people?
Yes, very good question. I did hear the first part of the question. I heard the lady say this. She has a heart condition and was advised to follow a low-fat diet. Yeah. So a very good question. So typically the federal bodies who are in charge of sort of disseminating public health advice, more often than not, they do get it right. British Heart Foundation, the CDC, World Health Organization, they tend to give evidence-based advice based on our current understanding of the literature. So they tend not to go in for things like fad diets that have been shown to be effective only in the short term. And they're also very cautious, which I think it's a good thing, because they will tend to only give advice if there is a scientific consensus to support that advice, more often than not. So you can always look at British Heart Foundation are always releasing, publishing press releases and papers. They published one very recently, actually, on fad diets and the effectiveness or lack thereof of fad diets on heart health. And so you can go onto their website and explore those and look for the advice that they give on healthy eating and exercise behaviors. And in fact, regarding exercise, you'll see that the American Heart Association, CDC, World Health Organization, American College of Sports Medicine, they all have their own sections on the website where they give advice, particularly on exercise behaviors, so the recommended levels of physical activity, and they're the same on all of the websites because they talk to each other and they all kind of acknowledge this scientific consensus. The other thing that you can do is we tend to, how can I phrase this? We tend to look at experts in kind of the wrong light. A lot of us, obviously, social media is ubiquitous in modern culture, and a lot of people are considered experts if they have, a lot of followers on social media. And I've written before this idea that Twitter followers are not credentials. Just because somebody has a large Twitter following or a lot of Instagram followers, that doesn't make them an expert. So what we have to do is look for legitimate experts. So if you want advice about nutrition specifically, find a registered nutritionist or a registered dietitian. Understand the difference between the two. Being a dietitian is a registered term. It's a protected term. You can only be a dietitian if you have the appropriate qualifications. I believe you have to have a master's at least in dietetics, and it is a protected term in the US, UK, Canada, and a few other places in Europe. So there is kind of a minimum level of expertise, if you like, to become a dietitian. Being a nutritionist is not a protected term. There are some excellent nutritionists out there. I know many of them. But because being a nutritionist is not a protected term, anybody technically can call themselves a nutritionist. It's a little bit more of a minefield. So you never really know somebody's dispensing good advice unless you do a deep dive on their background and their experience and so forth. And of course, somebody might be giving wonderful advice without any qualifications whatsoever. But we've got to give ourselves a chance to listen to the experts, find somebody who's a registered dietitian, dietitian or nutritionist, and as I've said, look at the websites of federal bodies, American Heart Association, British Heart Foundation, World Health Organization. They tend to give pretty good evidence-based advice.
Go ahead.
Can you point to any places, cities, states, towns, countries, whatever, just internationally, that seem to have a better ecosystem for sort of both from kids and on up, the role of information, the role of experts, and sort of a community shared understanding of how to make good choices? Are there any countries that do it better or well?
I don't think so. I don't think there's one country that's really standing out, because in some aspects, okay, so for example, it seems to be, from my personal experience, it's just anecdote, it's the problem seems to be worse in California. I can't say the states because I haven't been all over the states. Where I'm living now in California, there seems to be a generalized sort of anti-science rhetoric, anti-science movement. And we've seen in recent years how scientific and particularly health advice has been politicized. We're seeing this play out now in the pandemic, this whole thing about vaccines, the whole thing about masking. It's just become a political game now. So with the very legitimate evidence-based health advice to wear a mask, distance, and get vaccinated is sort of being undermined by the political system. So are there political systems where that isn't so much of an issue? Yes, there are countries around the world who seem to have gotten on top of COVID numbers. And that is because there is generally more of a unified trust in leadership. But there are a lot of countries in Europe where that's not happening. We're not seeing that in the United Kingdom. It's a shambles. And again, it comes down to messaging from leadership. The thing has to come from the top down. The messaging has to be right. Messaging of this pro-science messaging and broader critical thinking, it has to come from the top down. And so when you see, some countries, for example, South Korea, for example, who seem to have done very, very well in their messaging around vaccination and masking and this kind of thing, you see in other aspects of their culture, they're not doing quite so well. So with pseudoscientific practices and alternative therapies. So there's no one country where I see that it's done consistently well. Australia and New Zealand seem to have a very, very good model for how they've dealt with the pandemic. And it's easier because they're an island and they've closed themselves off. So their COVID numbers are very, very low. But pseudoscientific practices are rife throughout Australia. And they've got some of the worst cases of placebo medicine and alternative therapies. So yeah, in answer to your question, unfortunately, there isn't one country or system where I see this working better than others. But if you look at the data on this, what we tend to see is that people who are critical thinkers, people who are science enthusiasts, tend to make better decisions. They tend to use alternative therapies less, They tend to be vaccinated. They tend to wear masks. They tend to do all of these things that that seem to be for the benefit of public health. That the messaging seems to be more easily propagated in people who are critical thinkers, science enthusiasts, humanists, for example. So we've got that going for us.
All right, this will be our last question. I like this because it's a positive question from a YouTube questioner. What is the most, in your opinion, what is the most valuable scientific discovery in recent history that has propelled health and fitness science forward?
Okay, put me on the spot now. Well, I suppose, I don't know, maybe not discovery. I think I'm going to give you it's a great question. I'm going to give you a very boring answer. Like, I might be able to come up with a better answer, but I'll have to sit here and think about it, and we don't have the time. So it's been often said that if there was a pill that somebody could take that could simultaneously lower your blood pressure, lower your cholesterol, reduce your risk of cardiovascular disease, help you lose weight, or more specifically body fat, reduce anxiety, reduce depression, help get you fitter, improve your strength, improve your overall health and well-being. If there was a pill that you could take that could do all of those things together, then the discoverer of that pill would win the Nobel Prize. Because there's no one pill, there's no one treatment that can do all of those things together. Exercise does all of those things. It reduces your body weight, it reduces your cholesterol, it increases insulin sensitivity, it helps you to control blood glucose, it has social benefits, it reduces anxiety, depression, gets you fitter, it's stronger, improves your overall health and well-being, improves mood. Exercise does each and every one of those things. And we've known for millennia that being physically active is important, but it's only, I suppose, in the last 100 years or so that we've actually had the data to show, look, people who exercise regularly have healthier, happier lives and they live longer. And so I think having the shared understanding of this simple fact and having people at least acknowledging that exercise is a good thing, and it's now being acknowledged more in the medical community, in the clinical world, by initiatives like Exercise is Medicine, which is an American College of Sports Medicine initiative, this idea that exercise should be incorporated into every consultation with a primary care provider. These are all positive moves in the right direction. So it's not really a discovery, it's more a realization that exercise is really good. Not just exercise, but just being physically active. Get out, move more, and you'll be much more better off for it.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks again to Nick Tiller for being with us today and for that really eye-opening talk.
Thank you very much.
So thank you to everyone for attending today's program, and I hope you have a very happy, healthy, and safe Thanksgiving. Those of you who are in person, I hope you'll stick around for hanging out in the courtyard on this beautiful November day. Thanks, everyone.